Hello, class. This is part 4 of the series Foundations of Literary Study, and we'll be dealing in this presentation with material from Chapter 6 of Writing About Literature, and Chapter 6 deals with structure. This video is going to touch on some of the terminology, some of the vocabulary in Chapter 6. It's also going to, I'm also going to present a lot more information than what you'll find there. I just think it's a little inadequate, and there are some other terms that I think will be helpful to know. So there will be a lot more terminology in this video than what is customary. So, to understand the structure of literary texts, one must pay close attention to narrative development and to elements of form. Narrative involves plot and point of view, of course, which we've looked at in previous videos. But whereas plot deals with cause and effect relationships between events in a story, understanding how things connect together, narrative emphasizes the significance of events, their importance, their function and effect in relation to the whole. Form focuses on matters of presentation and arrangement, how the narrative or poetic material is organized, how it maintains consistency or coherence, and the extent to which it replicates or subverts the conventions or rules of a particular literary genre. We'll talk about both narrative development and form in greater detail, and we're going to start with narrative. I'm going to put some terminology up here for you first, and then we'll talk about each one of these. So there's the exposition or protasis, the complication, epitasis and catastasis, the crisis and climax, the denouement, peripeteia and anagnorisis, analepsis and prolepsis, and framing and interpolation. The first four terms that you see listed up there, exposition, composition, crisis, and denouement, are all sort of plot-related elements of narrative development. And so sometimes you'll hear critics talk about rising action and falling action. And rising action usually deals with everything from the exposition through the complication up to the crisis, and then the falling action is everything from the climax to the conclusion of the text. So we will start with exposition. The exposition is that part of the narrative where the major characters are introduced. Sometimes it is separated from the main narrative as a prologue, as in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, classic example of this. In classical drama, this part of the play is called the protasis. Originally, this part of the play would have been the responsibility of the chorus, the Greek chorus on stage. Individual characters that deliver the exposition are referred to as protatic characters. So sometimes you'll see the word protasis used instead of exposition, but it means basically the same thing. So epitasis and catastasis, these are also Aristotelian terms. Terms from Aristotle's treatise on poetry, the Poetics. And he uses these terms for the middle part of a play or a story where a problem is identified or a conflict develops. Complication is simply another word for this, but I do think you should know the terms because sometimes these terms show up in the critical literature. Crisis and climax are nearly synonymous terms. I don't know if I've ever been in a situation myself where I tried to treat them separately, but both signify that point in the story where the conflict can really go no further. A decision will be made, an action will be undertaken that will decide the outcome. The intensity of these moments produces tension and suspense, which is what most of us experience as pleasurable when we read a story or read a narrative or watch a play. A major crisis typically occurs right before the end of a story, but a single story may contain a number of separate crisis points. The denouement. This is the resolution of the story following the climax. Often, this means some degree of order has been restored to the universe. Heroes receive their just rewards, and villains are duly punished. I think it's always important, particularly when you're reading fiction, to pay close attention to who wins and who loses. That says a lot about the writer and about the writer's audience. If the outcome is particularly unpleasant for the characters involved, as in most tragedies, it's sometimes called the catastrophe. The denouement is sometimes called the catastrophe. Usually, the goal is for the reader to feel some measure of satisfaction or relief after the denouement or the catastrophe. And Aristotle's term for this is catharsis. Sometimes, particularly in plays, a summary or a commentary on what has happened will be included. That's called an epilogue, and that may be considered part of the denouement as well. Sometimes the climax or denouement involves a crucial discovery or revelation. The truth finally comes out in a very dramatic way. Characters move from a state of ignorance to a state of awareness and understanding, not always pleasant. This is called an anagnorisis. In many cases, this revelation, this understanding, is accompanied by a dramatic reversal of fortune called a peripeteia. So these two terms are often linked together. In tragedy, the peripeteia could be a fall from a position of power and prosperity into infamy and ruin, for example. In comedy, it works the other way, with characters sort of on the verge of catastrophe. They evade disaster and then wind up wealthy and oftentimes happily married. Analepsis and prolepsis. Another structurally important narrative technique is analepsis or flashback. Sometimes this is also called selective recollection. The opposite of it is prolepsis, which is not to be confused with its more figurative cousin foreshadowing. But prolepsis looks ahead to events that have not happened yet. Sometimes people use the word flash forward. That's fine. I don't have any objection to that. It's just not a word that I use. In their most basic uses, analepsis and prolepsis move the reader backward and forward from any given point in narrative chronology. Finally, framing and interpolation. In narrative works, writers often embed the main narrative of a story inside another story called a frame. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, the main narrative of the doctor creating this creature that runs amok in the countryside is related to is related in a series of letters by a man named Robert Walton. And Walton's perilous journey to the Arctic is how the novel begins and ends. So that's an example of a framing device. Another common practice is the embedment of self-contained stories or poems inside the main story. These are called interpolated pieces, interpolated stories, interpolated poems, interpolated songs, and they're often told by one character in conversation with another character. If you are familiar with Cervantes' novel Don Quixote, it's just absolutely full of interpolated stories, to the point that you forget that you're reading about Don Quixote sometimes. Okay, so from talking about narrative structure, narrative development, we're going to talk about form. And understanding form is often how we identify and classify different genres of literary work, particularly in poetry. So we're going to talk about length. We're going to talk about medium, dialogue, language, figures and patterns, meter and rhyme, and breakage. And some of these things are not covered in Chapter 6. So length is the most obvious aspect of literary form. It doesn't take long to see that something is long, right? So the length of a work shapes readers' expectations. The novel and 5-act play, for instance, allow for a lot more characters, a more complicated plot, interpolated stories than the short story or 1-act play allows for. This does not mean, of course, that long-form fiction and drama are inherently superior. Shorter forms have certain advantages and present unique challenges to writers as well as readers. Writing a good short story is not necessarily easier than writing a novel. Among other things, length can also tell us how a literary work was originally marketed and consumed. A good example of this is the short story, which I think of as mainly a 19th century form that emerged with the rise of middle-class literacy and cheap forms of print publication like magazines and newspapers. So the short story flourished in that kind of environment. Zora Neale Hurston's short story Sweat originally appeared in the 1926 journal, Harlem Renaissance journal Fire. So there's an example of this. And Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher originally appeared in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. So short form fiction thrived in environments where a publication marketplace, where magazines and newspapers could publish smaller pieces of fiction rather than entire novels. So medium, we typically think of print as the medium of literary texts, but it is sometimes a lot more complicated than that. It often is. The newspaper or magazine, for example, is a medium unique to certain literary forms, like short fiction. Many ancient works, like the epics of Homer or Beowulf, did not originally appear in print, but were transmitted orally and written down later. Some multimedia literary works incorporate images. This is especially true today with things like graphic novels, which are incredibly popular now. So this is Alison Bechdel's remarkable, just this wonderful book, Fun Home, which is an autobiographical sort of a memoir piece about her childhood and her relationship with her father and her coming out. But this is not just a modern issue. William Blake, his works are famously multimedia. This is his really famous poem, "The Tiger, 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 Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night." And when he printed it, he printed it with these. All the songs of innocence and experience were printed with these intricate graphic designs that have to be considered as part of the text. I mean, Blake created them. They blend into the text, as you can see there, and clearly he wants the image to shape the way we think about the text, and for the text to shape perhaps the way we interpret the image. So medium is an important aspect of form. Dialogue. How the text presents dialogue or conversation between characters, or whether it contains dialogue at all, is unique to different literary forms. So plays, for example, think about Macbeth, use speech prefixes to identify characters. That doesn't happen in narrative fiction usually. And so plays also provide a list of dramatis personae at the beginning that tells you, here are the characters, a list of characters. That's pretty typical. Whereas prose fiction, like I said, relies primarily on narrative cues and punctuation to identify dialogue. However, the use of indentation and quotation marks did not become regularized until the end of the 18th century. So you can read some early 18th century novels, and students are often confused by the way writers like Defoe or Henry Fielding handle dialogue, a conversation between characters. Even today, though, we can tell whether a text was printed in the United States or Great Britain based on the handling of dialogue. For example, we use double quote marks in dialogue, whereas in England, they use single quotation marks. Another aspect of form is obviously language. A writer's language is going to be carefully tailored to a specific audience and for a specific purpose. And as a student of literature, you got to remember that. I mean, most of what you read was not written for us. It was written for someone else. And it's important to understand that different audiences, different rhetorical contexts created the necessity for the use of different types of language. So language is also unique to certain literary forms. The language of epic poetry, for example, has properties like its frequent use of epithets that, I got two that's in there, that distinguish it from other poetic genres. Some literary forms are associated with more colloquial usage. I'm thinking about, for example, like realist fiction, for example. Whereas other forms use figurative language and complex rhetorical patterns that one typically does not hear in everyday speech. So one always has to think about how language and form serve the writer's purposes. Meter and rhyme. We'll talk more about this later, but there are many poetic forms, most of which have evolved over the course of centuries, if not thousands of years. Writers borrow these forms to connect with the past and other cultures. Most forms in English are defined by rhythmic patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables or meter, and regularly repeating vowel sounds, rhyme. And these can be traced back to poetry's origins in oral performance. And like I said, we'll talk a lot more about prosody and rhyme later in this semester. Finally, we're going to talk about breakage. Most simply, breakage is the spatial organization of textual material on the page. Familiar examples are chapter breaks in a novel, line and stanza breaks in a poem, and the division of plays into acts and scenes. Breakage helps the reader navigate the material, but it is also functional. Lineation or line breaks and stanzas or gatherings of lines indicate metrical patterns and rhyme sequences, but also they aid in controlling the flow of ideas. Act and scene breaks in a play cue stage managers and actors during live performances. The practice of dividing novels into volumes and chapters was often dictated by marketplace forces. A really good example of that would be Charles Dickens. He was famous for this. His weekly journal, Household Words, for example, published his work, published the work of some of his contemporaries like Elizabeth Gaskell, and his novel Hard Times appeared in a few chapters every week throughout the summer of 1854. It wasn't published as a single book until much later. So he would publish a few chapters, and so he had to create a stopping point. He had to create a break, a good place for to sort of keep the reader in suspense and hold them over and make them want to get the next issue of Household Words to see what happened next. Dickens was masterful at this. So let's look at some aspects of Macbeth. I'm not going to be exhaustive here because you may want to write a short paper on one of these topics, but I will give you just a few examples just to illustrate. So I'm going to talk about anagnorisis and interpolation in Macbeth just for a moment. So with anagnorisis, we could look at Act 5, Scene 7, lines 36 to 52. This is when this is the climax of the play, the crisis. Macduff confronts Macbeth at Dunsinane, and suddenly, Macbeth has been saying the whole time, I'm not going to be killed by a man born of a woman. And he taunts Macduff with this, and then Macduff reveals something that Macbeth didn't know, and that is that he technically was not born of a woman. He was born by cesarean section. So he gets out of the witch's riddle on a technicality. And this is a revelation to Macbeth, and he has some choice words for the witches at this point, and then fights to his death. So that revelation, that sudden understanding, the recognition that he had misinterpreted the witch's predictions, is a good example of anagnorisis. Actually, it's not the witches; it's the apparitions that the witches summon from their cauldron that tell him that. Interpolation. So I'm going to point to two sections here. Both of them are songs. Act 3, Scene 5, lines 36 to 68, and Act 4, Scene 1, lines 44 to 58. These are the witches' songs, and they've only been included in modern editions of Macbeth for the last 30 or so years. For a long time, they were left out. I'll show you why. When you look at the folio text of Macbeth from 1623, here are the two relevant passages, and you see these are the two witch scenes. Act 3 is on the left, Act 4 on the right, and you can see there's in italics, there are some stage directions there: sing within, come away, come away. And then in Act 4, Scene 1, you see the stage directions again: music and a song, black spirits. Later, long after Shakespeare had died, a man named William Davenant, a Restoration playwright who had been in Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, in the 1630s, probably had access to the songs that were sung in Thomas Middleton's play, The Witch, and he incorporated the lyrics to these songs into his printing of Macbeth. I think it was in the 1670s sometime, I think. And the point is that the lyrics were not printed in any version of the play in Shakespeare's lifetime. And in the video on Macbeth, I talk about how Shakespeare probably didn't write these songs at all, although he certainly may have known of them. And then only recently, like I said, have the lyrics, the verses to these songs been included in editions of Macbeth. So they are examples of interpolation. It's interpolated musical pieces and accompanying songs. So talking about more structural issues, I'm going to talk a little bit about breakage, about lineation. So here's an example of some of the problems that editors encounter when they're preparing text for print. We're going to look at Act 3, Scene 4, just 2 lines, 122 and 123. And here they are. This is how they appear in the folio. I've blown it up considerably. So what you're going to notice here is that we have 2 half lines, attend His Majesty and a kind good night to all. They look like separate lines. They're printed that way. The problem with it is that it ruins the flow of Shakespeare's blank verse to break the lines like this. And the reason for that is that the speech prefixes, you'll notice that the speech prefixes for Lady Macbeth and Macbeth they're indented. All the speech prefixes in the play and the folio are indented like this, which creates a problem for the compositor. The compositor was the person who took the metal type pieces and loaded them into the forms for the printing press. Well, the compositors could not fit entire lines in the columns that they had to fit, in the forms they had to fit them in, so they would have to break the lines, and indenting the speech prefixes like this made it even more of a challenge for them. So there are these broken lines, and another one is right below it, this really famous line in the play. It will have blood, they say. Blood will have blood, Macbeth says. This is right after he sees Banquo's ghost. And again, it's 2 half lines. It's 1 line printed as 2 half lines. That really those 2 lines belong together. And in our Oxford edition, this problem is solved here by putting extra space after Lady Macbeth's name to indicate that her phrase, a kind good night to all, is part of the line above it that belongs to Lennox, attend His Majesty. And that maintains the metrical coherence of the play. And then down below that, Shakespeare's, Macbeth's line, it will have blood, they say, blood will have blood. It is restored to just 1 line. So there's some examples of how just the process of printing a text can impact the breakage, particularly of lineation. So problems in scene breakage. We're going to look at Act 5, Scene 7. This is the scene that starts with Macbeth. He kills Seward's son, and then Macduff enters, and they fight, and then Macbeth is killed and has his head chopped off. There is a lot of stage movement going on in Scene 7, and comings and goings from the stage. And I'm going to put up another section from the 1623 folio here. This is the scene where Macbeth fights young Seward, kills him, and basically mocks him by saying, "Thou wast born of woman, but swords I smile at, weapons laugh to scorn, brandished by man that's of a woman born." And then he exits. He exits the stage. Now, in a play, when the stage is vacated, that is usually when a scene break is put in. No one is left on stage. A new scene begins, and then characters repopulate the stage. So what happens here is he kills Seward, he leaves, and then Macduff enters. But in the folio text, it's all just one continuous scene. There is no scene break. And in fact, this happens several more times in Scene 7. So this is how it looks in our edition. The Oxford paperback edition maintains the structure of the folio, scene 7. Macbeth kills Seward, exits the stage. There's the sound of battle and combat, and then Macduff enters, but there is no scene break. However, some editors, for the sake of consistency, decide to go ahead and put a scene break in there. So here's the scene in the Oxford critical edition of Macbeth. A really amazing edition of Shakespeare in a lot of ways. But they do make interesting editorial decisions, and one of them is to go ahead and put scene breaks in scene 7 of Act 5 every time the stage is vacated and before another character enters the stage to begin a new scene. I don't remember how many scenes they add, but it is several. I think they break scene 7 into at least 4 or 5 scenes. It could be even more than that. So thinking about the material you read for this week, A Rose for Emily, and Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, looking at Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, structurally, what would you say is strictly expository in the story? What would be the complication, the crisis, the denouement? Is there more than one possible answer to any of these questions? In what ways does Faulkner's breakage of the story complicate its plot? It's really interesting. Faulkner does very interesting things with chronology in the story. So you have to really pay close attention to his breakage. Looking at Ode to the West Wind by Shelley, how does he use breakage to organize the ideas of his poem? Thinking in particular of stanzas, how he uses his stanza breaks, and how those breaks form into sections, and what those sections tell us. So there are some questions for discussion. You might take these up in your discussion post. And that concludes this presentation on structure.